Welcome to the Fearless Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and this week I speak with Isaac Woodward to address the growing criticism from the isolationist conservative right over AIPAC. The American Israeli Public Affairs Committee has had its fair share of criticism from both the left and the right. The popular claim is that AIPAC is an arm of Israel and that it allows Israel to interfere in our domestic politics. The growing popularity of being anti-Zionist or anti-Israel on the right has sparked a political conversation, most recently in Tucker Carlson's interview with Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky. The claim seems to be that AIPAC is a mechanism for the Jewish elite in DC to strong arm our elected representatives into voting for pro-Israel legislation and funding. Massie claims that they do this by buying off our elected representatives, directly donating to their campaigns or taking them and their families to Israel. He then further claims that if you dissent from AIPAC, you will be punished, squashed by the Jewish elite in DC for dissenting or questioning their authority. Or, as he seems to imply, the popular narrative. The interview between Tucker and Massie alludes to great cynicism for our political system, but also to a larger conspiracy that we touched on in the Candace Owens episode a few weeks ago, that Jews rule our political elites in DC and in Hollywood. This conversation is important, especially as isolationism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism are becoming more popularly held beliefs on the conservative right. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Isaac Woodward, welcome back to the Fearless Project podcast. I'm so excited to continue the conversation we've had about Tucker and Candace here today.
Thanks, Dominique. It's a pleasure to be back.
So today we're going to look at the arguments against AIPAC, both on the left and the right. Maybe one of the more popular arguments against AIPAC that you have heard in just political commentary, especially since the start of the Israel-Hamas war in October of 2023, is that AIPAC is an arm of Israel and it's used to interfere in our domestic politics. Maybe more sinisterly, the growing isolationist right, the Candace Owens, the Tucker Carlsons, seem to imply that AIPAC is an arm of the Jewish conspiracy, the ring in DC that controls our politics. So we're going to address what AIPAC is in the first half of this episode, where they get their funding and their money from, what is a super PAC, what can they do, what can they not do, why is AIPAC not FAR registered, and then we're going to look at the interview from last month on Tucker Carlson's channel with Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky. So Isaac, let's educate the audience. What is AIPAC?
Yes. So I'll start with an overview of three separate entities to a degree, separate thrusts that people could be referencing when they talk about AIPAC, and it's also just good to know in the nonprofit world. So there's AIPAC proper, which does lobbying and education and advocacy to people elected in Congress and to the public, but they don't directly work in political campaigns or races or primary challenges. So it's once people are in government, they'll go talk to them about this issue. And there's a separate entity of direct political donations. This is historically, it's something since the founding of American history. Groups in civil society of Americans can get together, decide to pool their resources, and try to achieve something on a given issue. It's just the nature of what nonprofits do. And they can do that through directly giving to candidates in their races. But there are election laws which set caps on the amount of money that can be given both by individuals and then by these organizations to candidates directly, where if, say, I was running for Congress, I could have a bank account, the money goes there, and then I can use that for ads or other things in politics that I want to do. And there's a separate side called super PACs. So these are political action committees. A super PAC is a term coined after the Citizens United decision, which ruled that the dollars we have is a form of our speech. If I choose to pay someone to go talk about issues to someone, that's a form of speech. And then if I created a nonprofit that goes and on a regular basis does ads or education or sharing information about candidates or policies, that is what the work of a super PAC would do. Now they're banned by election law from directly working with campaigns. So if I was in this member of Congress or candidate state, the money could not go to my bank account. I can't directly coordinate or talk with that super PAC entity. Even if we're saying similar messages, it can't be done through coordination. And that's meant to keep the integrity and a little bit of the money out of politics. And then if there happens to be alignment on those views between a super PAC and candidate, that's helpful, but it's not necessarily essential. So those are the three categories of things that AIPAC works in. Historically, it was created in 1967, and part of the impetus for AIPAC was Jewish Americans and others getting together and seeing the results of the Six-Day War, where Israel was attacked on all sides, its existence threatened, and they decided, hey, we should do more to educate Americans about the importance of Israel, to care about it, and hopefully to have some form of support for it. Those are the three categories of work that AIPAC does that people could be referring to. There's the lobbying members of Congress that are elected, there's giving to candidates directly, and then there's a separate super PAC action of talking about candidates or issues, but not directly coordinating. Historically, the origin of AIPAC goes back to 1967 after the Six-Day War, where Israel was attacked on all sides and its existence threatened. And so a group of Americans over here, without funding or support from the government of Israel, decided to create a nonprofit that would work to educate and advocate on this set of issues. It was not until 2021 that AIPAC began to do those other two aspects aside from lobbying, where they started to give to candidates. And so that's a relatively small amount of their history where they do anything directly in political races. And you can kind of take those as separate issues to critique or approve of, depending on where you're at. Hope that answers your question.
Mm-hmm. One of the critiques Tucker Carlson makes in the interview that we're going to look at shortly is that AIPAC is not FARA registered. So FARA is the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So all foreign entities or sovereign nations who lobby the US government, which, yes, with all the conversation around AIPAC, one of the most famous claims is that Israel is the only nation that lobbies in this way, which is not true. It's unique in the sense of it is funded by Americans who care about the US-Israel relationship. So it is country specific, but foreign entities lobby the US government. If you go to DC, any law and lobbying firm is going to be FARA registered, and you have to take meticulous account for all your interactions with that foreign agency, and it's reported back to the federal government. So Tucker Carlson basically makes the ask to Massie, like, why isn't AIPAC registered? Should they be? And he says, yes. Why is that technically incorrect?
Yeah, so essentially they're talking in vague generalities about FARA, but they don't get into exact details that it has to be direct money or support given by this government to this entity, like for that government's interests. If diaspora populations of Jews in America or Armenians for Armenia or Turks for Turkey decide to get together and they want to advance the cause of their fellow citizens or relatives that still live in that country, and they do it without direct financial support, they don't have to register with FARA. Because then it gets into a free speech issue. Why would you have to say your speech is limited and curtailed because you happen to have an idea that agrees with the interests of another country somewhere else? It's very different, though, if you're paid directly, because then you can get into ethics about, is it really a grassroots thing? Is it really genuine opinion? But they vaguely hint or imply that FARA should apply to AIPAC, but they present zero evidence. It's a very concrete question. If there are checks, if there are receipts, if there's that kind of support, then AIPAC would be in violation of FARA. They could be held accountable and they'd have to register or face consequences. Thomas Massie is a member of the House of Representatives. He knows people on the Government Oversight Reform Committee and other entities that have the direct role of supervising things like that. He could call for an investigation. He could reach out to people if he wanted to make that happen. But I think it's telling that he doesn't, because he probably knows there's not actually evidence of that. He's just kind of annoyed with them as a result of some of the implications for them opposing him in his races, which we'll get into. And he also probably knows that he couldn't convince a majority of his fellow members of Congress to agree and support it, which I think is also telling.
Mm-hmm. I want to go through and highlight where AIPAC gets their funding, just to disavow the narrative that it should be FARA registered and that Israel funds AIPAC. They do not. So what I'm about to show you is from Open Door. So any super PAC or lobbying firm is registered. It's all public knowledge and information. Isaac, maybe if you want to walk through like where is AIPAC ranked as far as super PACs go, and why is this not dissimilar from other super PACs?
Yeah, so it's not even in the top 10 of total revenue or giving of different super PACs. Many other entities give a lot more, and I think it's an example that we'll see throughout this of kind of a double standard applied, where even though the money is not abnormal or not the most significant, and the methods that we'll talk about too aren't somehow nefarious or different, AIPAC, because it's a collection of initially Jewish Americans and now others advocating for a Jewish state, it's somehow held to a different level of scrutiny, and completely normal things that they engage in, like supporting candidates or lobbying, are seen as nefarious. And I think it's a telling example that there's not anything that stands out unique to them compared to other interest groups, but they're treated with a different set of rules.
Mm-hmm. For those who are listening and not viewing on YouTube, I have Open Secrets up, and it distinguishes between where they get their funds from. So we have a little over 17 million for this year, and it's all either crowd fundraised through small donation amounts or through large single donors. But again, Israel is not listed, and I think it's important to highlight where their donations come from. I believe they have about 4.5 million members of AIPAC. Isaac, you can correct me if I'm wrong, many of who contribute a monetary amount, as many of us do. Remember BLM and the BLM riots and the GoFundMes and everyone's bios and giving to BLM after George Floyd, and then the race kind of wars here in the United States that ensued. It's not dissimilar from that kind of funding or campaigning effort. I also want to highlight too, when it comes to the double standard with Israel and kind of the accusation that they interfere, which Massie will go on to talk about in this episode. Massie makes the claim that they have funded ads that speak out against him in his district for his past elections. That's also not dissimilar from George Soros, who gives a huge amount of money to various policy issue related organizations. He also gives to a super PAC of his own with, I believe, 25 million this last year. Black Lives Matter helped flip Stacey Abrams' seat in Georgia. So this is not dissimilar to other social issues that Americans are passionate about. And I think that's one of the biggest lies when it comes to AIPAC. Isaac, I don't know if I know you feel passionately about this as well.
Yeah, I just think you have to approach a question like that of people talking about some kind of conspiracy, or at least opposing AIPAC, as Massie goes on to do, and ask, okay, what are your objections? Do you object to a certain motive that they have for doing it, or to certain methods that they have? And you get a variety of a little bit of those, but as we've talked about, the initial motive was people seeing a strategic interest in a moral cause in the state of Israel and wanting us to continue an alliance and partnership, and to have an investment in that, essentially. It's their full right under the Constitution to advocate for it. Once they create that entity, they have a variety of ways they can try to operate to achieve that, through lobbying, direct political donations, and indirect through super PACs. And again, it's just a standard not applied to other things. I'll note there's examples like Thomas Massie is the chair of the Second Amendment Caucus, and yet the NRA, which supports him, and others in the caucus will engage in many of the similar tactics. And you could agree or disagree with their perspective, but there's nothing illegitimate about them trying to educate people in a district about the gun views of a given member of Congress. In the same way, there's nothing illegitimate about AIPAC supporting candidates that agree with them and then informing voters about candidates that don't agree with them and trying to hopefully have their opponents win.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I showed on the screen the large dollar amount donors, all individuals, started big companies, wealthy individuals, but these are issues that they are passionate about. And again, this is their constitutional right to fund organizations that represent their vested interests, whatever those reasons for having that interest might be. And then currently on the screen, I have Open Secrets listed, and you can see some of the other huge super PACs. You have American Crystal Sugar, Blue Cross Blue Shield, to talk about big pharma or the pharmaceutical companies. That's probably one of the other super PACs that gets the largest critique of the political right. You also have the National Association of Realtors. So they just changed the commission structure. So there are ways in which super PACs do affect our lives, even down to buying a house and what that looks like. But AIPAC, again, is not dissimilar from other super PACs who lobby the US government in their own interest. Isaac, I also would love to get your thoughts on why criticizing AIPAC at this moment in the cultural political conversation on the conservative right is occurring, and how is that birthed out of this extreme stance on isolationism being peddled by Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and many others.
Yeah, a few points to look at on that. A brief overview too on the timeline. So when you talk about AIPAC, it's also relevant to talk about military funding to Israel, because that's one of the primary issues they care about, since we don't give economic aid, or humanitarian aid to Israel, but we do give military support. And also what that looks like in practice for people that are curious. That doesn't look like us just pumping money into their bank account. What that means is America makes the most advanced military technologies. We're constantly updating it, and we also have older stores of previous generation technologies that are still more effective than certainly Hamas will have, or many other entities, but they're not the most up to date. They wouldn't be what we'd use against China, for example. So oftentimes we'll provide military support by taking these storehouses full of older weapons and then giving those over, and occasionally too selling updated military technology. And then the money that we give to Israel, so to speak, will go to American companies and American manufacturers will make the new weapons that would be used in future fights. So it supports American jobs. It's essentially the taxpayer paying a portion of themselves to make these things. And if you believe that you want America to have strategic deterrence ability by having the most up-to-date weapon systems so that other countries are intimidated to attack us, I just think that makes the most sense. If you want to send a signal for people to be peaceful and to not mess with you, it helps if people know you're the biggest and strongest and most well-equipped. It's kind of counterintuitive to people, but having those weapon stores and upgraded technologies is actually a far better way to preserve life than to have a pacifistic view to not have weapons. Unfortunately, it's not the world we live in. So that's the nature on the strategic alliance. And talking about the military funding, people will often highlight the fact that Israel is the largest recipient of our foreign aid, but they don't tend to mention that the second largest funder is Egypt, and there's a very concrete reason for this. So beyond us just agreeing with Israel, there's a question of strategic congruence of our interests and theirs. So going back to the peace deals between Jimmy Carter and Israel and Egypt at the time, after decades of hostilities, part of the agreement that allowed them to come to peace, and then Israel gave back the Sinai Peninsula, which they'd taken in a conflict, and actually, ironically, tried to give back Gaza. They wanted Gaza to be owned by Egypt, and Egypt said no because of the difficulty of the population and terrorism. But setting that aside, after that deal, that is when Israel became the largest recipient and Egypt became the second largest.
So, Isaac, we've seen the rising popularity in isolationism on the conservative right. Why do you think it's appealing for isolationists to critique AIPAC? And is there any fault kind of in the logic, or what are they missing? Because a lot of these isolationists are pro-America first. Let's put American policy first. Let's rebuild America. Let's make America great again. Therefore, we must withdraw from any interactions abroad. We should not fund any conflicts. We should not send money abroad. What are they missing? I feel like they're missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, and also by saying Representative Massie in particular is consistent as a libertarian. He opposes all of this. That's a very small subset of members of Congress and the House and Senate. You can take that consistent position, but the vast majority of Americans are not in that position. They're okay with some degree of economic aid and some degree of military aid as both soft and hard power for advancing our interests. And I'll note too, a lot of that in practice means ensuring free trade and allowing us to not have to use American military personnel to guard certain things. So for example, the Suez Canal or Straits of Hormuz or other areas that are key for global shipping and have a concrete effect on like what you can buy at Walmart or the price of gas at the tank. For centuries, the British Empire would maintain this free trade along with partners, and then America kind of took over that mantle. So it's just important for people to note if the isolationist position won, there would be a very concrete material impact in their lives. Maybe they would be okay with that, but it's worth pointing out that that's the case. So people are losing this and thinking it's as if it's just some kind of charity or something we're doing that is because of some sinister lobby, when actually it's about strategic interests that exist. And there's not something unique about how that's done with Israel. The only thing you could point to is maybe the numerical figures, but to just give a little bit of context on that, when people will question AIPAC's influence and advocate for isolationist policies, they will cite the fact that Israel is the largest recipient of aid. And that goes back to the peace deals in the 70s, where after decades of conflict, they were able to establish an armistice at first and then later kind of more military and economic cooperation. And that was good for both the people there because it led to preservation of life, including Americans who like to be tourists in both countries. But also it was very vital to having the Suez Canal, which goes between those two countries, able to flow freely. Before that, Egypt had blockaded it, had cut off Israel, and done different things that affected all of those various economic implications. So if you want to look at the cost we give numerically, both to the aid of Israel, which is the largest recipient, and then to Egypt, which after the peace deal is the second largest recipient of military aid. It's funny if people want to talk about some corrupt Egyptian lobby, which makes us pay that. It's kind of absurd when you apply it to that case. But it's because of a very concrete reality that we decided was worth investing in. So I think isolationists need to realize what implications would happen. And one other note I'll give that Massie and others, when they want to question the conduct of military operations in Gaza or elsewhere and casualty figures, people should just know that if they want to be consistent with Massie and give no military economic aid and also don't engage in military conflicts or support them that have these figures, there's no war America has had in the last 100 years or so at a large scale that would qualify for that. The amount of civilian casualties killed by even U.S. operations during World War II, both Japan and across Europe, was higher than what's happened in Gaza, Vietnam, all of these various issues. And if you were to condition it and say, therefore, America shouldn't be supported, or one of our allies looked at us and said, we can't be allied with America because of this given military prosecution. And that's just not how things work. You still maintain a friendship to a degree, and then you can sit down at the table and have differences over what policies you want to advance. But as long as you live in a dangerous neighborhood, which the world is, with threats like Russia and China and Iran, you don't get the luxury to only work with people you totally agree with. So if people don't go all the way to what Massie and libertarians advocate of just complete isolating, they have to make those prudential trade-offs of who to support, how much do you value your economic security that you get from global trade, and then what kind of moral standards will you apply to given military conflicts, and is there a consistency? And in the case of Israel and AIPAC, even isolationists will apply extra scrutiny and attacks to that country in a way that's not justified.
I also want to point out that AIPAC does not just lobby on behalf of our interest with Israel, but they also speak out against anti-Semitism here in the United States. So it's also disingenuous to make this lobbying group appear to just represent the interest of Israel. It has great implications for American Jewry as well. And so with all of this context, we're going to move into looking at Congressman Massie's interview with Tucker Carlson. Isaac, in part 2 of this podcast, we're going to respond to Senator Thomas Massie of Kentucky and his interview with Tucker Carlson. Massie, since taking office in 2012, has been historically anti-Israel. He makes the point that he is anti-all war or foreign aid to go towards wars. And he is an American first libertarian, conservative-leaning representative. And his interview is important because it speaks to the trend of growing isolationism on the conservative right. And I'm going to touch on some of the points he makes regarding his isolationism, But then we're also going to look at some of the points he makes as far as the AIPAC conspiracy. He has a lot to say about that. And then we'll view some of the tweets and stuff he's made surrounding Israel and the war in Gaza and aid, but also largely his just support of American Jewry in America. So in the interview with Tucker Carlson, he paints the narrative that AIPAC buys the allegiance of our congressmen and our elected representatives. And if you dissent or you push back or you don't toe their pro-Israel line, they'll punish you. At one point, he talks about ads that AIPAC ran against him in his district for his election. And that is actually a popular narrative in opposition to AIPAC. Many on the left have been making this critique of AIPAC for years. It hasn't just come up surrounding the Israel-Hamas war. But in this clip, Massie talks about why he votes in opposition to any legislation that has to do with Israel funding.
Last month, we voted like 15 or 16 times on issues related to Israel. And, I've been hit because I voted no on all of those.
Why do you, because you hate Israel, or is there another reason?
No, because I'm against sending our money overseas. I'm against starting another proxy war. I'm against sanctions because it's going to weaken the dollar. I'm for free speech. Like, all of these resolutions run afoul of those things, and that's why I can't vote for them.
All right, Isaac, do you have any initial reactions to what he claims is, his top line reason for not supporting pro-Israel legislation?
Yeah, a few things. I think he's consistent across not wanting to fund wars and also just civilian military aid, and that's a position a lot of libertarians take. It's ideological. In reality, it's a tiny fraction of the amount actually spent, but he's consistent on his libertarian views there. But where I think he gets, a little inconsistent, or at least is missing the other side of the free speech coin. It's that, again, groups of Americans can come together around an issue set and use their money and their words and speech to try to advocate for a cause. And part of that, when you want to make an impact, is to go to your elected member of Congress and to try to ask them to do something. So AIPAC does this. They'll find constituents in pretty much every district they try to work in. As a former Hill staffer, that's the best way to get an actual audience. So, for example, when we were sorting congressional mail you could see the zip code. And if you could see someone's writing to you from outside the district that you represent, that is an easy thing to put on the if I can get to it pile. But constitutionally, you're not elected to represent the person outside of your district. But if someone in Massie's district or others hears about AIPAC or has their own, more often they'll have their own independent views, then they'll look around and see, oh, this issue group cares about it. They can choose to support them, and then AIPAC will help educate them. Sometimes they'll coordinate these congressional trips where a lot of people will come at once, and they go and do lobbying and advocacy days. This is completely normal. It happens on every issue. You'll see this too sometimes, where celebrities will pop up when one of these things is happening, like Jon Stewart comes by on animal rights things, 9/11 aid, and also just average people. That's a part of the democratic process. And the fact that there's a group that tries to coordinate it doesn't make it somehow suspect. But also too, I can respect the courage of his convictions to stand, against really a majority of both parties of Congress, but in particular the Republican Party. I think he's wrong on this, but at least I think he's doing it in his own mind for principled reasons. However, part of what you have to respect of being outside the mainstream is that there's a lot of people that disagree with you. And if he's running in a primary and there are Republicans running that are in the mainstream that view our relationship with Israel and support as a key issue or something they support, it's completely legitimate for him to face the consequences for being out of step. Now, he's managed to defeat election challenges, and so good on him for, commending the trust of his constituents, so it hasn't actually hurt him. But to just be upset that he's targeted or money is spent against him, I think is a little short-sighted. One other aspect to add just about his own situation in Kentucky. Mitch McConnell will be retiring, and so there'll be a vacancy in the Senate seat. There's also rumblings that maybe he would run for governor. So AIPAC in particular has also done some ads across Kentucky because if he were to get into the Senate, that would also make it more risky because he would go from being one of several hundred members of Congress to one of just 100, and the key votes, particularly on foreign policy, would have a large impact. So it's nothing personal, but that is an actual motive. One other element to add, which you might even get to, is there have been accusations that he's personally anti-Semitic. There are several tweets he's done or retweets and some things his staffer said that I think were at the very least questionable, ill-advisable. One of them was a quote by a, I think, former Nazi thinker or official, but misattributed to Voltaire. So I think probably, and to be fair, he didn't know that's what it was. And it's a rather famous quote, but there's enough of those things that if people see his voting record, they can also sometimes maybe question, hey, do you have some issue here? My personal assessment, having known him and his staff a little bit when I was working in Congress and others, is I don't think it stems from some sort of deep hatred, but we do see a failure of analysis. He's a very bright guy, MIT engineer, so you can appeal to his rationality here, a inconsistency with which he's approaching this particular issue compared to other issues he does. And if he just wants to blanket not support any countries in aid, that's fine. But the fact that there's a rather large set of Americans that disagree means that he'll probably face repercussions for that.
Mm-hmm. I think the disingenuine part of this interview, which if you want to go watch the full interview, there's actually only a small segment of it that focuses on his votes for Israel or his nays for Israel, and then his relationship with AIPAC. So I recommend that everyone go watch it in its entirety because we're going to be taking clips from it. But he kind of paints this narrative of, well, they came after me because I dissent from them and I vote my conscience. And I don't know why they would come after little old me. And as you point out, he has larger political ambitions. So I think Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, when they tend to paint these narratives of the Jewish lobby or Jews coming after them or being victims of a larger Jewish conspiracy, they oftentimes don't paint the entire narrative. So they are still running ads against him in his district, which he does talk about and we'll watch a clip of. But it's because of those larger political ambitions that would have far-reaching implications for support for Israel and does directly impact AIPAC's mission statement. So there is nothing wrong with AIPAC running these ads against him. I think the other point that you make that's great is he holds a contrarian belief. Having a pure isolationist foreign policy is not in lockstep with really either party. That would be a radical position of the far left as well. So to paint himself as this contrarian dissenter, and he would have more people who vote like him if they weren't bought off by AIPAC, I also think is a very disingenuine stance for him to take, which is essentially what he paints throughout this interview. Well, I have fellow Congress members who come up to me and tell me that they would vote in lockstep with me, but they have an AIPAC babysitter, and because they get money from AIPAC, they can't, or they fear AIPAC's reprisal, so they won't vote with me. And I think, first off, he has no concrete examples of this. So really it's hearsay with his word against others, but also it isn't concrete and it paints him almost as a victim. He doesn't victimize himself, but kind of as this lone thinker. So he definitely takes up the mantle of being a contrarian.
Yeah, I think, and one brief thing to add on that too, this is something you touched on in the Candace interview. It's also just not helpful to attack the motives of a given group, or in this case, set of Americans that are Zionists, Christians and Jews. He could make the argument that it's wrong, that, hey, and he talks about this a little bit. He says we are, 30 something trillion in debt. We can't afford it, whatever, let that argument stand. But to then say, and the people that want us to spend more are doing it for some nefarious reasons. Both parties across the whole set of issues want us to spend more on things. And you can say they're wrong, but is it corrupt, when the Farm Bureau asks for more, whatever? You can look into individual issues, but you don't refute the argument by just saying politicians are doing it for corrupt reasons. The essential causation of most, members of Congress views, unless you're just a complete sociopath, is if you want to run for Congress, or any position, you sit down and you figure out which party you tend to align with more, because you need to pick a lane. People don't sit down and say, what do I get more money for, being a Democrat or Republican? If you really are that vacant of a mind, it would be kind of difficult to do it. And there's not enough money in it really to incentivize that. So people have to pick broadly a right or left spectrum. Within that spectrum, there's a set of issues. If you're right of center, where are you at on guns or abortion or Israel, Ukraine or whatever? On the Democratic side, you have a similar question, and then you pick. But when Tucker and others talk about this, they kind of assume you're on your spectrum, and then you just put your finger to the wind and figure out, oh, I like this. I'm going to be pro Second Amendment because of the NRA, which is, if this same argument is applied there, Thomas Massie is the chair of the Second Amendment caucus. Like, does he do that because he gets money from the NRA, or are the members of that just in the gun lobby paid off? No, they believe something, right or wrong. Then a group formed by Americans who agree with them go and say, that's great, you're right. We're going to help support you because we want your ideas to go forward. AIPAC is no different. None of these things are different. The causation typically is you have belief X, and then group Y sees that and decides whether or not to support you. And to just pretend that it's the opposite, that you're this empty vessel, you don't know what you believe, but you look at who's going to give you a check to get reelected. That's just not how most of these things work. It's not to say money in politics has no influence, but you really can't survive or be articulate or compelling if you don't actually have any core beliefs. So I just think that's an important overall thing for people to note in politics. Otherwise, you tend to get conspiratorial. And if people deeply believe that, it's kind of fatalistic because you just think these powers outside your control will shift it. But also it's going to make you ill-equipped to actually refute arguments. If you want to convince a certain position, do the research, figure out how to articulate it, convince people in your district, and go with it. Because if you just think, well, as long as a billionaire gives to this thing or that, or AIPAC gives, I have no chance. Like, it's extremely anti-democratic in the small d sense.
Mm-hmm. When Tucker asks him about his opposition to legislation surrounding Israel, he has this to say. He brings up the issue or concern of free speech. And what he references in the video I'm about to show you, and I think interestingly enough, because he talks about how he's an isolationist and doesn't send aid abroad or doesn't vote for that. The bill he talks about basically violating his free speech is a bill that would amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and expand what anti-Semitism discrimination is to protect American Jewry. So the piece of legislation that he's talking about in this clip I'm about to show you is not about sending foreign aid abroad. This is about American Jewry and combating Jewish hate. And he has this to say about how that would violate free speech.
Recently, they brought a bill to Congress, and this was actually a binding bill, not a non-binding resolution. Like,
Right.
This was going to have the effect of law, and people would get, prosecuted if they engaged in anti-Semitism on campuses. And the problem with this bill is they use some international definition of anti-Semitism on a website somewhere. My first question is, why didn't you just put the definition in the bill? Why are you pointing to somebody's URL in a piece of legislation?
You are the Congress, right?
Right, we are the
Write the
Congress.
laws.
We should be. Instead, we're referencing a website that's not even, hosted in the United States.
It's so interesting. I'm not entirely sure what his issue with the definition was. He essentially makes a claim that the first issue is that this definition is not from a website hosted in the United States. He's kind of making an America first argument here. I don't think it really holds any ground because the definition that was used, and by the way, this proposal did pass in the House, 320 to 91 nays. There was some bipartisan support. And essentially what this would do would codify, as he stated, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism into Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a federal anti-discrimination law that bars discrimination based on shared ancestry, ethnic characteristics, or national origin. So his initial issue seems to be with the definition. There typically is collaboration across sovereign nations or across NGOs when it comes to defining anti-Semitism. That's not something we really see parsed out to individual nation states. Oftentimes they do adopt these international definitions, largely because combating anti-Semitism has been an international effort since the Holocaust. So I don't know if you have any commentary, Isaac, on his issue with the definition alone.
Yeah, and I think we'll get into a little bit maybe about what he says about scripture maybe being in violation of that. But yeah, I think it's just a kind of silly semantic point. I mean, you could take that definition and then copy and paste it into the legislation if that makes them feel better, or change a few words. But as you said, this is a international problem of hatred going back for millennia. So the fact that a lot of people have thought about it around the globe and got together does not make it suspect. And in the end, it's language. And he's a originalist as well, like in the Constitution in the legal sense. Take the plain words of it. If you don't like it, revise it. But the fact that a link is hosted somewhere is really irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. Even defining genocide was an international effort. And so just seems to be a lack of maybe understanding surrounding remembrance and the Holocaust and fighting anti-Semitism since the Holocaust, and the call to never forget and that it would never happen again. This actually, Isaac, is the clip of him talking about blood libel. And I want to point out before watching this that he makes the claim, kind of similar to Candace Owens, that this is a violation of free speech and it affects Christians specifically in their religious expression.
So I went to this website, and it's got a fairly short definition, but it's also got examples of things that would be considered anti-Semitism. And some of these are actually passages in the New Testament, if you will, would be banned by this international definition of anti-Semitism. For instance, saying that Jews killed Jesus, which is in the Bible, he was not welcome among his own people. Okay, and so that would be anti-Semitism. And if you engaged in that on campus or just offered that as a thought, let's say in a classroom, you would be anti-Semitic.
Okay, so that's kind of the point he's touching on, that it violates our Christian free speech to mention that biblically and historically it was the Jews who called for the killing of Jesus, which he's not wrong if you're quoting scripture in a very literal sense. But what he's talking about is the historic blood libel. And I actually went to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's website where they do outline criteria. And one of them states this: using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, i.e. claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libel to characterize Israel or Israelis, is defined as anti-Semitism, which is correct because there's a malicious intent in bringing up the Jewish identity of those who called for the killing of Christ. This is a historic anti-Semitic trope, as they state in the definition. And I also want to point out that Massie says this will limit Bible verses in the Bible. There's nothing stated about any specific Bible verse in the definition as well. I think that's a bit of fear-mongering on the part of his Christian audience. So I don't know if you have any
I totally agree. And this is something we cover, this excellent course taught by a theologian, Dr. Gerald McDermott, on history of anti-Semitism and Christianity and how it all goes back to heresies or misinterpretations. It's not something biblical. Obviously, a religion founded by a Jew would not be anti-Jewish, but it's a shame that has to be said. But it's also just a technical confusion. Yeah, there's no passage of scripture that would possibly qualify. It's about context and theologically too, the actual mechanism of the death. So some Jewish leaders called for it, and then Pilate ended up being the one who actually went through with it. It was his decision whether or not to go through with an execution because the Jewish officials didn't have the authority. And then it was Roman soldiers who actually put the nails in and did all of that. So, is this an anti-Roman or anti-Latin? Like it gets so polyglot. And we know as Christians, it's not at all about the ethnicity of the people. It was a global empire of the Romans. Many different people had many different hands in it, and every human heart will be stained with sin. And because God put his revelation through the Jewish people and came through that, he happened to be around an audience of people that chose to do that. But we know wherever he would have appeared, our sinful hearts often can reject and miss the message, and we're all in need of redemption. And it's just not at all an accurate version of Christianity that could blame the Jews for that. And certainly no Christian would ever fall afoul of this law by quoting scripture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it rests in the intent of why you are bringing this historical point up, which typically a lot of these political leaders or commentators are not bringing it up because they're doing a Bible study. They're bringing it up to villainize or other either American Jewry or Israelis and the U.S.-Israel alliance at large. I won't make a claim specifically about Candace Owens because a specific example is not coming to mind, but the sentiment that she puts forth is that there is a clear distinction between the Jews and Christians. And she's talked a lot about the gulags in Russia and the Jews persecuting Christians in some sort of an ethnic cleansing in Russia, a very ahistorical revisionist history that she's been peddling on social media. But it kind of is rooted in that blood libel, that othering of Jews, and that clear distinction of Christian and Jew, and that somehow supporting Israel then undermines your Christian identity or your right to express your Christianity here in the United States, which I think is a complete fear-mongering tactic on the part of some of these isolationists to make patriotic Christian Republican Americans take a step back and go, oh, well, why do I support Israel? And it's unfortunate because it's ill-founded, and it is an ancient anti-Semitic trope.
Yeah. Just one brief point on that, not to get back to the Candace thing. And I think too, as you see her or other commentators, if you look through history and you're perpetually trying to pick out things that people from an ethnic group you're talking about and seem to not like or seem to be suspicious of did at various points in history. So, there were Jewish members of the early Soviet party, and then a lot of them were kicked out. Trotsky was famously killed, and later the Soviets locked down the Jewish population and wouldn't let them emigrate and definitely mistreated them. Russia had a horrible history of pogroms against it. It's insane to claim like they had some level of authority to persecute Christians. But aside from the ahistorical claim of it, I am suspicious of the motive and the heart of someone who wants to look through history to say somebody that shared some blood with these people I'm talking about now did this bad thing to people that had my beliefs, therefore give us sympathy, or there's something suspicious. Like, that is a fundamentally anti-Christian thing, to ignore the individual human soul and to try to group people by those sentiments. It's fine to group people, with ideologies, to say Marxist ideas are bad and have led to this, but it's not about an ethnicity. It's not about that. It's about ways people can execute evil. And if you want to continually fixate on the ethnic origins of people to try to weave some narrative about a current victim status, it's just extremely unhelpful and anti-Christian.
Mm-hmm. And I want to point out too, as you mentioned, it's grouping an entire people group together because of their fixed identity of being Jewish, which is what fascism did across Europe. It's what the Soviets did as well during World War II and the interwar years. And I just think it's a really dangerous place to be, that's becoming a popularized opinion or argument. So talking about the Nazis and World War II, he has this to mention as well as violating free speech. He addresses comparing Israel to the Nazis as being a form of anti-Semitism.
Other examples in there that were hard to believe, for instance, comparing the policies of Israel to the Nazi regime would be anti-Semitic. But the question is, what if their policies ever became the same? Is this a static definition?
Or what if we just have different opinions and your opinion is now a crime?
Right. I mean even if it's abhorrent.
Even if it's wrong and stupid.
Yeah, it's still legal.
Okay, so he seems to take up issue with it violating his free speech, that no matter how disgusting it might be, you should be able to characterize Israel's actions in Gaza as being that of the Nazis during World War II. Why is he wrong in this instance? And there is a fine line between free speech and hate speech, and this issue has always historically towed that line.
Yeah, and it's about the history of where those ideas come from. It's been a long it's like literally neo-Nazi talking point to both like the Nazis and then both accuse the Jews of doing the things that the Nazis actually did, which then they often support. It's a weird mix of ideas that don't quite cohere together. But you see this on campuses, you see this other places. I've seen this in debates I've had with Palestinian diaspora populations at protests, and they'll make these direct comparisons, and they always love to go to it. And you kind of ask, like, what exactly is that? Part of it is it's a shorthand for people that don't know history well to just pick, well, this is a really famous thing people know about. These were bad guys, therefore you're like these bad guys. That's a little bit of it. But also there's a sick way in which there's pleasure taken often in taking a group victimized by them, another group, and then calling them that evil group and accusing them of doing the things that they did. I mean, it'd be like if you're talking to a Black American and you said, like, you're the real slaveholder, like you're putting me under Jim Crow, you're doing something like this. Like, one, it's probably wrong, but also you're uniquely targeting that history in that period because it has emotional significance, and it's morally perverse to accuse the victim or the descendants of the victim of doing something that they were actually in the community that faced that criticism. So, and again, like, we have very robust free speech laws. Nobody's being locked up for this. Like, there's a fairness and a context, and our legal system sorts through that. It's not to say if Israel literally passed like a Nazi law or statute or copy and pasted something, you couldn't point that out. But it's about the spirit of it and inaccuracy, and recognizing that trope and that example is used by people that want to emotionally terrorize and target. And I think to miss that is just to kind of be obtuse.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think you could not have stated that better. It's taking a generational trauma, which something like the Holocaust continues to impact Israel. It directly shapes Israel's foreign policy decisions as well. Their robust defense system, their hard realism outlook on the region and foreign policy at large. And it still impacts families today that are in living memory of what happened during the Holocaust. And so it is grotesque. And I also think it's interesting that the conservative right that's kind of towing this isolationist line and tiptoeing around anti-Semitism is up in arms that we can't call Israel Nazis or can't compare their actions in Gaza to the Holocaust and World War II and genocide. And yet they also tend to sympathize with true Nazism, or at least toe some of the same talking points of the interwar years and vilifying the Jews. It's this really weird, it's almost like, are you so upset because the definition's calling out maybe some of the points or logic in your argument? So that part of the interview talks about free speech and what's related to free speech. A large segment of the interview that talks about Israel is focused on AIPAC, which we've already talked a lot about in the first part of this interview. We also talk about how AIPAC is funded by, I believe it's 4.5 million Americans. It's crowdfunded. There are some major donors, but they're all individuals. Israel is not a donor of AIPAC. It is not FARA registered. We went into the technicalities of it, but I want to really look at what Massie says, because essentially his claim is that AIPAC buys the loyalty of elected representatives, and if they dissent, they'll punish them. And he uses his example of AIPAC running campaign ads against him during his election as being a reprisal that a lot of elected officials would face if they dared to stand up or to question this AIPAC. And he doesn't say conspiracy, but essentially what he's alluding to is that there's this really deep-rooted network and they will punish you. And that's why you don't see dissent for Israel or legislation supporting Israel in Washington, D.C., which Candace Owens, when she talked about the D.C. Jews, kind of alluded to a similar sentiment. And so I'll play that clip here.
It's the only country that does this, that has somebody that, like, uniformly, I guarantee there's some spreadsheet at AIPAC where the AIPAC dude who's matched up with the congressman is there, and then all the congressman's votes on the issue. Oh, has the congressman been to Israel? They pay for trips for congressmen and their spouses to go to Israel. I'm not the only Republican who hasn't taken the AIPAC trip to Israel, but I'm probably one of a dozen that hasn't taken that trip, and the other ones just haven't got around to it.
In his interview with Tucker Carlson, Massie paints the narrative or the accusation against AIPAC, and it's twofold. The first is that our elected representatives vote for pro-Israel legislation and funding for Israel because they've been bought off by AIPAC. He highlights that can come in the form of direct dollar donations to their campaigns or through fully subsidized trips to Israel. It couldn't be because many of our elected representatives are Christians and might support Israel for theological reasons. Maybe they're Jewish themselves, or maybe they understand the importance of the historic U.S.-Israeli alliance and its role in U.S. grand strategy and national security. It couldn't be for any of those academic or theological reasons or security reasons. He implies it's because they've all been bought off. And then second, he talks about how if you dissent from AIPAC, if you don't vote in AIPAC's interest, you'll be punished and you can fear a smear campaign in your upcoming next election for your district, in which he goes on to talk about how AIPAC ran ads against him. So this is that clip where he's talking about those trips.
It's the only country that does this, that has somebody that, like, uniformly, I guarantee there's some spreadsheet at AIPAC where the AIPAC dude who's matched up with the congressman is there, and then all the congressman's votes on the issue. Oh, has the congressman been to Israel? They pay for trips for congressmen and their spouses to go to Israel. I'm not the only Republican who hasn't taken the AIPAC trip to Israel, but I'm probably one of a dozen that hasn't taken that trip, and the other ones just haven't got around to it.
So there he's talking about the fully subsidized trips. So these senators or congressmen have been wined and dined along with their wives in Israel, and that's why they vote for pro-Israel legislation. I also think he takes some pride in being, as he highlights, the only one who hasn't. He talks about how those who haven't just haven't gotten around to it. I do think there's a sense of pride in his contrarian political stances and how he votes.
Yeah, I think so. There's several problems with that, but I think there's two main categories. He's attacking the methods of AIPAC and the motives of AIPAC and those that receive the money. So first on the methods, I'd almost want to ask this question to him rhetorically. You've told us things that you see as corrupt. What ways are you okay with a nonprofit organization attempting to persuade members of Congress and the public about a certain set of issues? He calls out a few things. One, the idea that there's a babysitter or a contact that the organization has. Every corporation that tries to lobby, every interest group that tries to lobby, whether that be PETA, pro-life things, NRA, right to work, unions, they will have a contact person that manages a certain number of members of Congress. I know people that do this for different groups. The purpose of that is to share information and to actually do your job, to communicate things. The idea that it's some kind of babysitter or handler is just insane. Something else he talked about in another part of an interview is resenting the idea that he was given homework, as he called it, by AIPAC when he was running for a certain race, basically to ask, say what his position is on Israel, and do a policy paper. And this is something that many organizations do famously. Americans for Tax Reform, which promotes lower taxes, has a pledge they try to get people to sign. All Heritage, other groups, Emily's List, and Equality Campaign will do rankings of members of where they're at on various issues, but they want to ask and collect the information from members about their voting, or if you're a candidate, what you say you're going to do, because their responsibility is to the constituents of that organization to let them be informed. Telling people about where a congressman stands on an issue is not corrupt. Now, it was his right to decline to do that homework assignment, as he called it, but to be kind of offended that he was asked is a little bit crazy. Like, how else would you rather than figure out where you're at on Israel? That's one part of it. So he doesn't seem to like the methods of that. Trips as well, he seems to imply is somehow corrupt to take members or staff on trips. As a former staffer, as I keep mentioning, there are countless examples of this, of staff trips or member of Congress trips to virtually all of our allies, certainly those under threat. I know people that went on trips to Taiwan. There are trips that people have gone on to the UK, to France, Germany, other places. If there is a constituent interest in that area or some strategic significance that's being addressed, it makes sense to actually go there on the ground to see things. So if you're, skeptical of people who are going to vote on Israel actually going to Israel to see it for themselves, I just don't really get the motive behind that. Or the methods. So he seems to not like the methods used, which I think you could apply to pretty much every lobbying group or advocacy organization. And then there's the motives. He seems to imply this is trying to buy people off or like persuade them into something, but it just gets the causation wrong. If you sit down as a nonprofit and your goal is to advance this policy and people donate to you to do that, you have a responsibility to actually do that. That means you try to talk to people and convince them. And if they are not convinced and they will vote against you, it's not a personal thing, but you say, our interest is to try to see this thing advance. Therefore, in your race, if somebody runs against you and they agree with us, we're going to give to them, or we're going to highlight how you're wrong on some of these issues. Like, that is their whole purpose. It's almost like a shareholder responsibility in the corporate sense. And then to imply that, again, the causation is money exists and the members of Congress create their belief to fit the money and get the check is just, I think, a libel against his fellow members of Congress. I think if he was really pushed on that, he would backpedal and say, I'm not saying everybody's corrupt, but it's just, I think, disingenuous to imply that. If you have a position and another group shares your position, they will want to support you and they'll want to continue to educate you on how to vote and advocate. You're not forced to take that money or do any of those things, but it's almost an attack on free speech to a degree and political giving to say that he wants groups of citizens to not be able to come collectively together and try to influence their elected members of Congress towards positions they agree with. And AIPAC is no different.
Mm-hmm. I 100% agree. This next clip is from Rising at the Hill, and they're providing their commentary on the Massie Carlson interview.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to have AIPAC say, we represent 4.5 million people who are Americans. When you look at the polling of how people feel about the U.S. support of Israel at this point in time, when they've committed many human rights violations since October 7th, that's way more Americans. That's tens of millions of Americans that don't approve of what Israel is doing right now. And you have Congress people in lockstep willing to do what AIPAC tells them to do. Why? It's not because they have very many constituents that are in support of the United States giving Israel endless funding. It's really about, I'm going to continue to get donations from AIPAC.
So, yeah, I see you shaking your head, Isaac. She's commenting on kind of what Massie is putting forth here, that constituents elect representatives into office and they don't reflect their public opinion. Instead, they're bought off by AIPAC. She's completely also incorrect. The majority of Americans still support Israel. According to a recent Cap Harris report for June, 64% of voters are paying close attention to the Israel-Hamas war. It's down 9 points from May, which is not unusual. Our American electorate has a shorter attention span for conflicts over a long span of time. But support for Israel remains consistent at around 80%. 67% of voters say Israel should retaliate against Hezbollah until they stop firing rockets in the north. And so for those 18 to 24, the younger generation that is traditionally more pro-Hamas, the pro-Palestinian movement, 53% agreed with that. And then those 65 and older, the demographic was 85% agreed with that. So American popular opinion on Israel is that they have a right to defend themselves. They should defend themselves against extremism and provocation in the north and the south. And there is still widespread support for Israel. So just to disavow that claim that the electorate holds one position and then elites in Washington toe a line because they're bought out by AIPAC is completely incorrect. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, again, it's just ridiculous. There are two things that people can ask about in polling. There is, do you support our relationship with Israel? Do you want it to be strong? That's, as you said, like polls very high across the board and has for decades because there is a notable alignment and collection of strategic interests we share. Then there's a separate question of, in a given conflict, do you approve of everything that's happened? And I think even those numbers will be skewed because there's such misinformation out there about what actually happens, like the famous hospital bombing that we've talked about before, where it was claimed it was done by Israel. 500 people were killed. It turns out it was actually Islamic terrorists that shot the rocket. It misfired, and only a few people were killed. So the results, the event, and the people behind it were all lied about, but all the major media ran with it. And that kind of thing is almost never corrected. It kind of gets out into the bloodstream of people hearing it. So even that will disproportionately increase the negative polling people will give. But even for legitimate things people disagree with, that's totally fine. But there's the question of an alliance and then approving of a given set of abuses or conduct or misconduct, whatever you want to call it, in a conflict. For example, with other allies we have, we're allied with the Philippines, we're allied with Singapore, we're allied with the UK and France. Those alliances don't say we approve of every way they're prosecuting a military conflict anywhere in the globe at any given time. If you're asked details, maybe you'd push on that, but we don't make our basic support for an ally contingent upon agreeing with every policy. There's a threshold that you could hit where if you think they are so unethical, maybe you have to sever that. But you could see there that like they don't really want to get into specifics. They just throw out vague numbers. They'll quote Hamas, Ministry of Health statistics, but to look on the ground, hey, these are rules of engagement that the IDF regularly does that we disapprove of and think are in violation. So let's threaten to defund them over that. They don't really get that concrete because you can't point to that. What they can point to more is accidents or other kind of stray examples. And then they zoom out even more to just imply it's conspiratorial and to lie about public opinion and polling on stuff. And I would just say it's also politically lazy. If that woman is correct and she could point to, hey, most Americans here disapprove of the relationship with Israel or funding for this war, but members of Congress are in lockstep, that is like a political campaign operator's dream as far as a race. If you poll a district and they are widely divergent from their member of Congress on something, that is like the easiest type of race to prosecute. Go out there, do the ads, knock on the doors, have the grassroots base to show these people they don't represent you. People lose elections all the time. But it's kind of demonstrative that I think she's ignorant of that process, or in the case of most of these commentators, too lazy to try to go look for that or exploit it. Because if she was correct that there was that wide divergence, it'd be very easy to get people kicked out of Congress. In the end, it doesn't matter how much money you get from any entity if you are wildly divergent. You're never going to get a Tea Party Republican to take over Nancy Pelosi's district in San Francisco. It doesn't matter if you have all the money in the world. So I think it's inaccurate, it's libelous, and it's also politically lazy.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more. In this clip from that same segment, she makes the claim, which Massie also makes, that if you don't toe the AIPAC line, you'll be punished for it.
Getting very much money from AIPAC, but they're threatened by the reality that if they are not in lockstep with other members of Congress on Israel, then they'll have all these attack ads put out against them. We saw this happen to Senator Nina Turner in Ohio. It really crushed her race to have them pour so much money into her opponent in a Democratic primary simply because she was critical of Israel.
So she's making the same claim that Massie makes, and we're going to look at his specific claims. He walks Tucker Carlson through his different elections and what he claims AIPAC did to him in those elections. But she's essentially saying if you don't support AIPAC or if you don't agree with them, you are both incentivized through money and then also fear of how they're going to retaliate against you. But Isaac, I want you to talk to the freedom we have here in America to run campaign ads to educate an electorate or a population or a district on where their candidate stands on a specific issue. This happens all the time.
Yeah, it's frustrating. And if people really think about it, it is actually kind of elitist and anti-democratic to do these attacks.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the reverse position? You want people that have a certain perspective and they're an elected member of Congress or they're running for something to be immune from critique or immune from having quotes of theirs put in ads because you think they're entitled to have that position, like as if they're mini dictators or just entitled to be in office. And then if you criticize them or raise money against them, you're somehow like attacking them or being unfair. No, they serve at the pleasure of the people that elected them. And the moment they cease to do that well, it is the right of the people to turn over and defeat them. And all any one of these groups can do in the end is to take information and educate. It's up to the voters to do certain things. But again, with analogies, like if you apply this to any other issue, it becomes clear. In Democratic primaries, for example, like Planned Parenthood, if you have two candidates and there's one that is more staunchly pro-abortion or for reproductive rights as they characterize it, Planned Parenthood will give to that candidate and not to the other. They have done this. They've tried to unseat Democrats for this. They'll intervene on both sides. And what is the reverse thing you'd want to say? Like imagine you're a pro-choice voter. Would you rather not have a group you support educate you on the perspectives of the candidates so you can decide where you want to be at on that spectrum? It's just kind of absurd. It's almost calling for like more opaque processes where you can't understand where candidates are at and they're insulated somehow from criticism. And the ultimate form of criticism is to vote against you and vote for someone else. And that is the full right of the constituents. It's not the right of a member of Congress to be perpetually elected and immune from criticism or attacks.
In the clips we're about to watch, it's going to be two-part. Massie's going to talk about how AIPAC started a whisper campaign, a smear campaign against him prior to 2021. Isaac, he talked about how AIPAC formed its own political action committee in 2021. So they started giving money directly towards candidates and then also putting money into ads, speaking out against those running who opposed Israel or AIPAC's interest and stated objectives. So this first part talks about his interaction with AIPAC the first time, and he claims he was punished essentially for dissenting their ask to, I believe, write a paper. Could you talk really quickly about that, Isaac? He makes a claim in the interview.
Yeah. He goes back to his first race in 2011 or 2012.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the details of how AIPAC does this, but I do know from having worked in other groups, it's very common to try to have a scorecard or a set of assessing where candidates are at on your given issue. If you're on guns, you'll ask about Second Amendment. If you're pro-life, pro-choice, you'll ask about that issue. And sometimes that's presented in the form of like, hey, can you give us a brief, like one pager or statement like where you're at on this stuff? And it's kind of funny, like he talks about it as if it's an imposition or it's somehow like acting like he works for them. No, in the end, you can say no, and then they have the right to say to people that support them, at the very least, we don't know where he's at on these issues, or he told us he disagrees. So when you go to the ballot box, just be aware of that. It's not at all odd. Many groups do this. And again, it's kind of like a way, I feel like it's a little bit of entitlement, like, don't touch me, don't highlight an aspect of my beliefs. But no, you don't get to be both. You don't get to be the brave contrarian who doesn't do the trips and is a lone dissenter on all these issues, which I do think he's sincere about, but then also complain when groups that exist to advocate for issues will highlight the fact that you don't support their issues.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So this is the first part of that conversation.
With their 501c4, before they had a super PAC, they were running educational advocacy ads against me, saying that I'm bad on Israel. They didn't say don't vote for him. They just said he's a bad guy. And so I said, all right, well, you're not welcome in my office anymore. Because for years, I invited him into my office. Let's talk this through. Let me explain to you. I'm a libertarian-leaning Republican. I don't vote for foreign aid for anybody. So don't be offended when I don't vote for your foreign aid. I don't vote for wars anywhere. So don't be offended if I do that. I'm for free speech, even if it's abhorrent.
Do you have initial thoughts on that part?
Yeah. Again, it's just, I think it's just a category confusion to act as if it's a personal thing or about being offended. AIPAC is not offended. To make it concrete, people in AIPAC will support these policies. Part of it is for continued military funding for things like the Iron Dome, which pays money to get a rocket, which when a terrorist attack happens and they try to kill innocent Jewish and Arab citizens in Israel, we help fund a defense system that shoots a rocket to intercept it. It is a completely defensive technology, does not harm anybody. AIPAC, among other issues, advocates for funding for that. They try to convince Massie to do that. He has said no because he doesn't do any military funding. That's his right to have that position. But it's not a personal offense to say, okay, thanks for meeting with us. We've heard this candidate's running against you. They do want to fund this defensive technology. They do think it's great if Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and Haifa aren't having rockets rained on them and random people killed. And we think it's a relatively worthwhile investment for the U.S. to support this. We can agree to disagree. But again, to act as if like he just is entitled to be in this seat independent from criticism from an issue group. If he were to shift on the pro-life issue and suddenly become pro-choice, Susan B. Anthony lists or other pro-life groups would highlight that. And if he were to get offended and say, well, what's your issue with this? Like, my vote's not even the deciding factor. I just have this view. But no, the whole mechanism of politics is not to make it all personal. It's about issues and ideas. And it's the right of the voter to know if he is in line or out of line with what they believe.
Absolutely. In this clip, he's talking about AIPAC's actions against him to bring awareness on where he stands on Israel after 2021.
But now they're banned from my office. The situation went from bad to worse. This election cycle, they spent $400,000 against me, $90,000 last fall running TV ads in my district and Facebook ads and whatnot, trying to equate me with the squad. And then this most recently, and in fact, as I'm speaking to you today, even though my election is over, they're still running hundreds of thousands of dollars of negative.
So he's highlighting how much they spent against him. They're still running those ads. And you highlighted his maybe larger political ambitions. Why? Maybe you could explain why that is so important.
Yeah, so Senator McConnell will be retiring, which will leave a spot in the Senate that he could potentially run for. He's got very high, what they call name ID or awareness, so he could be competitive for that. There's also speculation he might run for the governorship. And all of those things could have implications for the issue set. So again, I just think he has to put on his big boy pants and realize that if he wants to take a position contrary to AIPAC or to any other group, they will highlight it and probably hope that he doesn't get elected. And it's maybe particularly he's under scrutiny because he's a lone dissenter in the same way that I remember when the last pro-life Democrat was defeated in the House of Representatives, and he was under target for years because they wanted complete agreement. And also, particularly now in the House of Representatives, it's such a slim majority. Individual votes are actually pretty key. In this case with Israel funding, he is kind of a lone dissenting voice, along with a few others on the Israel funding. So yeah, there's more scrutiny because he might run for higher office and because he's out of the norm, and that's just part of politics.
Mm-hmm. So this next clip, he talks about the Whisper campaign, the first time that AIPAC really pushed to try and get him. I believe he was not incumbent, but they weren't sure if he was going to win his race. And so he claims they started a Whisper campaign and they used evangelical Christians to peddle this pro-Israel policy position. And I think us being in the space and being Christians and the organization he talked about, CUFI, is a thought partner. We have shared missions. I wanted to get both of our reactions to this part of the clip.
They didn't have a political action committee at the time. They couldn't spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars against me at that time. It was just sort of like a whisper campaign to try to, hey, don't vote for him, blah, blah, blah.
Why?
Because at that point, they sensed I wouldn't do what they wanted.
But what did they whisper against you? What were they saying about you?
Well, they would do it through, for instance, churches, evangelical churches. They've got an organization called Christians United for Israel, where they sort of co-opted evangelicals. People think it's a grassroots movement in Kentucky. It's actually a top-down movement from AIPAC, so that people who aren't even Jewish will feel like they've got to support Israel, no matter what.
This part of the clip particularly angered me just because, again, I think it's intellectually dishonest to claim that CUFI, a Christian nonprofit run and birthed out of John Hagee's church in Texas, is a top-down initiative from AIPAC. We work with CUFI. We obviously know people at AIPAC. We're in the pro-Israel space, so we all know each other. I'm sure we also have, similar donors. People who might give to AIPAC might also give to CUFI if they're so led to, because they share the same issue. But to claim that it is somehow some deep campaign of AIPAC to go in and somehow try and manipulate a large evangelical population to support Israel is unequivocally false. And I'm pretty sure he probably knows that as well. So I wanted to know your thoughts.
Yeah, and again, it does two things. It takes on conspiratorial tones towards the Jews that are minority, both financially and demographically, as far as total political donors compared to Christians, and then attributes them to somehow controlling or leading the over 10 million people affiliated with CUFI or other Christian Zionist groups or pro-Israel groups. And if you just speak to those people, it's rather insulting to say, yeah, you at your church believe this because like some rep from AIPAC or CUFI came and told you something. Some people read their Bible, they see the Jews mentioned a few times, they kind of have a vague recollection of this guy named Jesus who was a Jew, and so there's an inbuilt sympathy for at least understanding more. And not all Christians have the same theology or views on it, but a portion of them read that through and then see there's something about these people, and at the very least, we find an affinity because of our shared origins. Also, like going back to even the Crusades or other times from the rise of Islam, Jews and Christians were grouped together as people of the book. Other faiths and ideologies and communism have done this kind of thing too, targeting religious people. So there's a natural affinity that already exists. And again, to just imply like sinister motives or invalid methods when you are out of step of an issue set and people go about educating the people in your district about that fact. It's just, won't use that exactly. It's just rather whiny, I will say.
Mm-hmm. And in the interview with Tucker, of course, Tucker, who takes this just asking questions approach, which we've touched on, Candace Owens also taking, asks, well, why would they do that? And Massie essentially says that CUFI, co-opted by AIPAC, essentially this agenda to convert Christians to being pro-Israel, again, ignoring any natural affinity as Christians would have biblically for the Jewish community and for Israel as a nation, as the birthplace of our faith as well. Massie claims that they are manufacturing a reason for non-Jews to feel a need to support Israel, which I think he is a Christian. His Wikipedia, now whether or not this is what he practices, states that he is a Methodist. And that is also why I'm sure CUFI ran ads against him in his district, because he was a Christian in opposition to Israel. CUFI doesn't run ads against non-Christians. There's no need to. They wouldn't be talking to a specific voter base if that were true. So again, it's disingenuous to kind of say, oh, I don't know why they would run these campaign ads against me. Well, it's because you're a Christian who's staunchly opposed to Israel. And there is a call for us as Christians to support the state of Israel biblically. It's a biblical mandate. And even if you disagree theologically, to ignore the natural affinity Christians have for Jews in the Jewish community, to me, is just so disingenuous and so dishonest. Especially since Tucker Carlson has really focused on Christians when it comes to this issue, to then kind of flip the coin, I think, is just dishonest journalism. All right. So he also makes the the claim that he is not anti-Israel. He adds this kind of towards the middle of his interview with Tucker, talking about Israel. He claims, well, actually, I want to make a footnote. Like, I'm not anti-Israel. He kind of addresses anti-Semitism. So we're going to look at these two. First, his claim that he's not anti-Israel for any other reasons besides his isolationist foreign policy. And then we're going to talk about what he claims is AIPAC's character assassination against him by labeling him anti-Semitic.
Put a little footnote here. I'm not against Israel. I've never voted to sanction Israel. I've never said anything particularly, critical of Israel, other than, for instance, right now they're bombing. They've killed 1% of the civilian population in Gaza. That's concerning to me.
Do you have any thoughts, or do you want to roll both clips and then we can respond?
Yeah, if you want to play both, maybe, and then I'll hit the second one.
That they disagree with your views, which they do, and I think they have an absolute right to disagree with anybody's views. We all do. But they've called you a bigot, and they call you an anti-Semite and say you're a hater and try to destroy your character. That seems like a very different level of response to me.
Right. There's no need to do that. I'm not anti-Semitic. I don't have an anti-Semitic hair in my head, okay? I don't like AIPAC anymore. Like, I used to be neutral toward AIPAC, right? But I have no antagonistic feelings toward Jewish people.
Yeah, so I think there's a little bit of complications with, as I mentioned, some tweets that he put out, and one a staffer did
here,
later.
Isaac. We can, I'll show those here. So this is the first tweet. If you want to maybe describe for the listening audience what it is.
Yeah, so it's a famous Drake meme. On one side says Congress these days, and then American patriotism, implying they're saying no to that. He's waving his hand. And then Congress these days towards Zionism, and it's kind of a smile and support, as if Congress is prioritizing Zionism over American patriotism. I think there's a lot of issues with that. And there's other examples where, at the very least, his stances on funding, coupled with some things he said, it's not implausible for people to think there might be a personal issue. We can't know somebody's heart, and that's not really, the necessary to prove either way, to just think he's incorrect. But also, too, I think it's just a false dichotomy to think that there's a contrast between American patriotism and Zionism. I think patriotism fundamentally, in many contexts, I've heard you British people make this argument too, to love your country passionately, particularly if it's a Judeo-Christian rooted system and democratic, and you see that aligned in Israel, it's kind of a natural affinity. It's to say, like, do you really love your own family if you also care about your neighbors or other groups? It's just, false dichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, too, to claim, loving Israel, all of that's fine. But again, he's kind of making it personal. He views it as an attack when they fund things against him or whatever. But in reality, what they care about is how he votes. And if he also has iffy tweets that could maybe indicate some anti-Semitism, or at the very least, he does use this double standard language, it's reasonable to question it. But in the end, it's about his voting record and what he actually supports. And for perspective of AIPAC and a given issue they prioritize, like the Iron Dome, it's not about his views or his heart or something independently. But if he is close to the purse strings of Congress that could vote to either fund or defund the Iron Dome, which could have a direct effect on bombs falling on the head of, Israeli children, that has an effect. And he can disagree with them, but he can't complain when they will inform people about the divergence.
I also think I take issue with him saying he's not anti-Israel or anti-Jewish, because we addressed his opinion on the free speech matter of the anti-discrimination law that was passed, I believe, back in April, which he was one of the only ones to oppose on the Republican side. And then back in 2022, House Resolution 112, he was the sole nay. So the resolution was a 7-page resolution that called on the government to do all it can to protect Jewish individuals and organizations, to combat denial and distortions of the Holocaust, and to defend the rights of all Americans to practice their faith without fear of violence. Even the Squad, which he also references in his Tucker Carlson interview, voted in favor of this, and they are vehement on the left, staunch opposers of Israel. So I do take issue with him hiding behind his isolationist foreign policy or his absolute take on free speech, because this bill would protect your right to practice your faith free of violence. What freer expression could you ask for? Protection from the government. But the fact that he was the sole nay, I take issue with, because I think it highlights that he has this contrarian opposition to anything that addresses anti-Semitism for American Jewry. Again, this is not about Israel. This, back in 2022, this is before the war started. It seems to me to point towards a deeper, I don't think it's as overt anti-Semitism as Candace Owens has very publicly demonstrated over the last few weeks, especially. But I would challenge his argument that it's solely based off his isolationist foreign policy. I want to show the tweet that I believe you referenced earlier in the conversation. So for the listening audience, this was from his government, it appears Twitter, it's @Rep. Thomas Massie. He said, "You mustn't question Fauci, for he is science." So he's obviously talking about COVID. And it's an image of a big hand squashing people. And it quotes, "To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize." And he attributes it, the image attributes it to Voltaire, but it's a misrepresentation. It actually, the statement is accredited to the famous and notorious neo-Nazi Kevin Storm. And I think this kind of gets to the heart of what I think is a cultural movement, with Candace Owens really leading the charge, overtly making very radical claims of a Jewish conspiracy. And Massie in this entire interview seems to point to AIPAC as being one of those key instruments in the Jewish ring that rules DC. He's not as explicit, as I said, with Candace Owens. I'm not making that claim. But I think that there's a trend that is emerging. And if you look at the live stream comment section of Tucker Carlson's interview with him, it's obvious that this is becoming a more mainstream position of conservatives on the right. And here at the Fearless Project, we'll continue to talk out and speak out against it, because it's extremely dangerous, just as dangerous as neo-Marxism on the left and the protests we've seen over the last few months.
Yeah, and I think, again, with Candace Owens as well, this comes up, the idea that you're not allowed to criticize Israel, but in both contexts, with her and her professional affiliation with the Daily Wire that tends to be pro-Israel, or certainly anti-Semitism, it's reasonable to say you have accountability for the views that you're allowed to espouse under the First Amendment, but you don't have an unlimited check to keep getting paid by a group that disagrees with you. Similar with AIPAC, like, they can't force him to not speak or have his position, but he is allowed to disagree, but he also will have to face the implications for that. So anytime that issue is put into like these, like, they are against you, they will get you, they control speech patterns, it's just, it's very dangerous territory that has a long history. And at a basic level, it is just a misunderstanding of the American political system, where you can have your stances and your votes quoted back to you and to constituents. And if they disagree, you'll face accountability for that.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more. And that's why this conversation that we're having, we've had addressing Candace and Tucker, will continue to happen here at the Fearless Project, because it's dangerous and it's catching on like wildfire. Thank you so much for joining me today, Isaac.
Thanks, Dominique. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Fearless Project podcast. If you're interested to learn more, I highly recommend that you check out our Pathfinder courses. We talk a lot about Jewish-Christian relations in this episode. We have an amazing course taught by Dr. Gerald McDermott on Pathfinder. If you would like to support Philos in our educational endeavors, you can give to the Fearless Project at fearlessproject.org, or at the link in the description box below. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you next week.